Welcome to Critical Thinking and Practical Reasoning. We are still on Unit 2, Varieties and Anatomy of Argument. Today we will be looking at Section 1, which is Recognizing Valid and Invalid Argument. The aim of this session is to explain what a valid argument is, explain what an invalid argument is, and also identify valid argument and know how to evaluate an argument in the terms of validity and invalidity. Let's start. What is a valid argument? A valid argument is an argument that has a conclusion logically deduced from the established premises. This close relationship between the premise and the conclusion maintains validity such that when the premises are true, the conclusion is also true. And when the premises are false, the conclusion is also false. Let's look at some examples. The first of them, all Ghanaians are Africans. John Mahama is a Ghanaian. Therefore, he is an African. From this argument, you can clearly see that the first premise, which says all Ghanaians are Africans, makes an entailment of every Ghanaian being an African. Then the second premise says that John Mahama is a Ghanaian. So therefore, in the second premise, they identify John Mahama as a Ghanaian. It necessarily follows by the conclusion that therefore John Mahama is an African. So let me read the example again. All Ghanaians are Africans. John Mahama is a Ghanaian. Therefore, he is an African. This makes a valid argument because from the established premises, the conclusion is clearly deduced from the evidences that are presented in the established premises. Let's look at the second example. Since all squares are tables and tables are figures, therefore all squares are figures. Let me read it again. Since all squares are tables and tables are figures, therefore all squares are figures. This example might look a little tricky, but it is intentionally selected. Let's do the analysis. Since all squares are tables, this example is trying to say that all squares are tables. And if you look at the first sentence is actually two premises that have been conjuncted together. So this first part is the premise 1 says all squares are tables. Premise 2 says that tables are figures. But they've been put together into one simple statement saying, one complex statement saying, since all squares are tables and tables are figures. Now you should note that identifying squares as tables would also show that if you identify a square as a table, then you go ahead to identify tables as figures, then it will mean that squares are figures. And that is why the argument reads that since all squares are tables and tables are figures, therefore all squares are figures. So this makes a valid argument. I know that in real life situation, not all squares are tables. But you see, in validity, we don't consider real life situations. All we want to know is that per the established premises, does the conclusion follow from the premises? If the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, then the argument is considered to be a valid argument. So we can draw the conclusion that all squares are figures since it has been already established that squares are tables and tables are figures. Then squares are figures. So that is validity for you. Let's look at invalidity. And what is an invalid argument? An invalid argument is an argument that has the conclusion not logically deduced from the established premises. This could happen when the premises are true, but the conclusion is false or otherwise. Also, one could have all true or false propositions as an invalid argument. The controlling idea is that the conclusion of an invalid argument does not logically follow due to the established premises. So, you should understand that with the idea of cogency, right? Checking whether the conclusion of a deductive argument logically follows from what the established premises have said. If it doesn't logically follow from what the established premises have said, that argument is considered as invalid. It cannot be a valid argument, because if it's a valid argument, then the premises would have given enough grounds for you to accept the conclusion thereby. Let's look at the first example of an invalid argument. All birds are animals. No tree is a bird, so no tree is an animal. Now, let's break down the premises here and the conclusion. All birds are animals. Every bird you see is an animal. That's what it means. And it says, no tree is a bird. I think that's clear to understand. Then it goes ahead to conclude that no tree is an animal. But then you see, if it says all birds are animals and it says that no tree is a bird, it doesn't necessarily mean that no tree is an animal. The idea here is that since birds are distributed to animals, trees may be also distributed to animals. But here you are just identifying that trees are not birds. But maybe trees may be animals, so we don't know yet. Since we cannot be sure, there's no premise in the argument that gives enough grounds for us to conclude that no tree is an animal. So since there is an absence of a premise that will show that no tree is an animal, we cannot conclude that no tree is an animal. So therefore, to conclude that no tree is an animal will make an invalid argument. Let's look at the second example. Every Saturday, Amma goes to her mother's place from the market. Today is not Saturday. Therefore, Amma will not see her mother. Now, to make the assertion that every Saturday, Amma goes to her mother's house from the market doesn't necessarily mean that other days which are not Saturday, Amma doesn't go to the mother's house. So, since today is not Saturday, you cannot be sure to say that Amma will not see her mother. Maybe there are other days which Amma could see her mother and not necessarily Saturday. But from the evidence given from the premise 1, you can be sure of the fact that every Saturday Amma goes to their mother's house. But what you can't be conclusive of is what the other days which she may possibly see her mother. So, to make a conclusion that since today is Saturday, Amma will not see her mother will be an invalid conclusion. Hence, will make an invalid argument. It's wonderful having you guys. This session has enlightened students on the types of valid arguments. Cogency, you should know, is a hallmark of validity. Students can try writing out examples of both valid and invalid arguments to explore their understanding on the concept of validity in arguments. Take note of the valid argument with false premises and a false conclusion, valid argument with true premises and true conclusion, and also even the possibility of a valid argument with one false premise but a true conclusion and a true premise. Check out an invalid argument with all true propositions, meaning all true premises, all true with a true conclusion. Right. Students should try writing examples of their own, and I think it will help their understanding better. Thanks for having you Bye bye. We'll meet another time. Bye.